Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Just Law on IQRA TV. I'm your host Ilyas Bulbulia. This is the second part to the show. Just before our break, we were looking at how to make a successful spouse application, and what I had dealt with is initially the kind of documents that the applicant in their home country, whether it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, wherever it is, the documents that they need to get together in their home country. So we ran through those documents in terms of the English certificate, the TB certificate, how any previous relationship has come to an end, in terms of divorce certificates, and in terms of the current application that the applicant will be making, a proper marriage certificate for that. And now we've started looking at the documents that the sponsor in the United Kingdom needs to get together. And what I was explaining is that there are three key areas that one needs to look at when submitting documents relating to the sponsor in the United Kingdom. You need to look at the financial requirement, you need to look at the accommodation requirement, and finally you need to look at the relationship requirement. And what I had started looking at was the financial requirement. And what I was saying was that the sort of easiest application is where somebody has been employed for a period of 6 months, where the requirement is fairly simple. You're submitting 6 months wage slips, 6 months bank statements, and a letter from the employer. But it does get trickier where people have been self-employed, or they're relying on other forms of income. It could be rental income, it could be dividend income, or they're relying on savings, etc. Now, in my experience, the vast majority of refusals relate to finances, and all the problems that occur with applications and the time and effort which is spent in trying to get the application correct, the vast majority of that is spent trying to sort out the documents, the evidence that needs to be submitted for to meet the financial requirement. So it's not simply a case of, well, you know what, we'll submit 6 months wage slips, 6 months bank statements, and an employment letter, and that will be sufficient. Even for that very basic application, let's take 6 months wage slips. The Home Office will look at whether it's salaried employment or non-salaried employment, you know, whether somebody's got a fixed salary or they're working on an hourly rate. There are different rules about how your income is calculated depending on whether you're salaried or non-salaried. There are rules about what happens where somebody gets a promotion midway through and their income goes up. There's rules about how overtime and bonuses will be taken into account. There's rules about how only certain allowances are taken into account, other allowances won't be taken into account. So even with something as simple as 6 months wage slips to evidence 6 months employment, even something as simple as that has many potential pitfalls there. So you need to be very careful before submitting an application. You have to make sure that it's entirely correct. Now, obviously today we haven't got time to look at other ways of meeting the financial requirement in terms of self-employment, etc., and the exemptions to the financial requirement rules, and where you can rely on third-party support, etc. So let's just look at something very basic, which is where somebody is in employment, and let's just deal with that. It could be that somebody has changed jobs and has only been in this particular employment for 3 months, say for example. Now in that case, it's not sufficient to submit 6 months of wage slips, 3 months in the current job, 3 months in the previous job. That isn't sufficient. There are rules relating to what kind of evidence that needs to be submitted in relation to that. It's normally the case that you need to submit the last 12 months of wage slips, 9 months in the previous job, and then 3 months in the current job if somebody's just been employed for 3 months in the current job. There are rules about how the differing incomes from the previous job and the current job, how all that is going to be calculated. So even the most simplest of applications where somebody is in employment, even that has complexities in there. Now the other requirement, one is the wage slips, the other requirement is an employment letter. And again, there are problems that can occur even with something as simple as an employment letter, because it's not sufficient for an employer to provide sort of a standard letter that employers provide saying, yes, this person is employed by us, a fantastic employee, an asset to the company. You see many letters like that, fantastic as they are. That doesn't meet the requirements of the Home Office. Even something as simple as an employment letter has certain requirements which need to be fulfilled for it to be acceptable. For example, it needs to confirm employment, it needs to confirm when somebody started employment, it needs to confirm what the job title is, it needs to confirm what the person's salary is, it needs to confirm when the person started receiving this salary that they're relying on. So that's typically what needs to be in the letter. There are requirements about who can sign the letter, requirements about how up to date the letter needs to be. So it can't be more than 28 days old, etc. So even something as simple as an employment letter has many mandatory requirements which need to be fulfilled, and you need to be careful. You need to ensure that you meet the mandatory requirement. Finally, we've looked at wage slips, we've looked at the employment letter, and then there's an issue about the bank statements. Again, normally 6 months of wage slips, 6 months of bank statements are submitted. Again, there are requirements in relation to that. They've got to be originals. If they're not originals, they need to be stamped. They need to cover the same period. They can't be more than 28 days old. They need to demonstrate the net pay, whether it's monthly or weekly, whatever's coming into the account, it's got to match up with the income which is being declared on the wage slips. There are different rules relating to salary which is paid in cash, and the amount of rules relating to what's been deposited into the account, if there's a difference between what's on the wage slip or what's been deposited into the account. There are a whole host of rules, even covering something as simple as 6 months of bank statements that need to be submitted. So on the face of it, it seems quite straightforward. It's 6 months of wage slips, 6 months of bank statements, and an employment letter. But for each of those categories, there are additional requirements which need to be fulfilled before even those very simple documents will be acceptable to the Home Office. I mean, that's why, in my experience, it does become important that you, if you're doing it yourself, that you read the guidance which is available on the Home Office website in greater detail. I'll look at that in greater detail after we've taken our next call. Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, brother. You okay?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Good. How are you? You okay?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good, brother.
MashaAllah.
Brother, my name is Manjuri. I'm ringing from Bradford. I just want to find out, I'm working. I want to call my wife over. She's in Pakistan, basically.
Right, okay.
So what's the procedure of calling her over?
Okay. How long have you been working for?
I've been working for about 4 years.
Okay. With the
I recently got married.
Okay, all right. You're working for the same employer, I take it, yes? For the last 4 years? Okay. And approximately what kind of income is it that you're receiving from your employer?
I'm getting $7.50 an hour, like normal rate.
All right.
And,
Okay.
I get my working tax as well.
Oh, you get working tax credits as well? Okay.
I get that as well.
Okay, all right, okay. And then you don't receive any other benefits, do you? You don't get disability benefits,
no.
carers allowance or anything like that? Okay, no problem at all. Brother, thank you very much for your call. That's something that I am covering at the moment. So if you keep on listening, hopefully I should be able to cover that now before I move on to the next area of next requirement that needs to be fulfilled. Now, if you look at the brother who called in, working for the same employer for the last 4 years, and it sort of fits in with what I was discussing. The key sort of assuming every other requirement is met, let's just focus on finances. I think that's where the issue is here. That the person's been working for 4 years, fantastic. Now, what is the income requirement? That's the starting point. The income requirement is that the person needs to be earning 18,600 per annum. There's no qualifying benefits such as disability benefits, etc., which would mean that the person falls into one of the exemptions. And I'm assuming that we don't have enough savings to rely on either. So it's simply a case of being able to meet the 18,600 income requirement based on one's income. So you need to work out really in the last 6 months how much the person has received in general terms. So as long as the person is receiving 18,600 per annum, over 6 months it would amount to 9,300. I think the person's working on an hourly rate. So as long as over the 6 months, the amount that's been received, it doesn't really matter if it fluctuates because this is an hourly paid worker. As long as the person receives over 6 months £18,600, sorry, 9,300, which is half of 18,600, that would be sufficient. And hopefully this would be one of the easier sort of applications that one would be making, because one only needs to submit 6 months of wage slips, the employer's letter meeting the requirements that I just highlighted, and 6 months of bank statements showing the income going into the bank account from the employer. So hopefully, if that requirement can be met, hopefully the other requirements that I've highlighted, and I will highlight, should be something that will fall into place. Just before the call, what I was looking at is if somebody who's trying to do the application themselves, the partners abroad, the sponsor here, wants to give it a go, the starting point is you must not just look at the immigration rules, you must look at the very detailed guidance which is available on the Home Office website. I mean, to be quite honest, I would caution against trying to do the application yourselves. In my experience, very rarely do applications which are submitted by sponsors themselves in the United Kingdom, very rarely do they succeed. You need to take advice from somebody who specializes in this area of law and does this kind of work regularly, who knows the latest rules, who knows exactly where to look, where the problems are likely to be, who knows how to put those matters right. So I would caution against trying to do this kind of application yourself. Really try and get advice, even if it's just initial advice. At least you'll be given sort of a steer in terms of what you need to be looking at, what you need to do. If there's a problem, at least your advisor will highlight that there is a problem, and then you can put it right. The danger is, not having done this before, bringing up the guidance, trying to read the guidance, and then finding out that the application that you've submitted based on the guidance that you thought you were following, it then transpires that actually you've done something wrong because you've misunderstood the guidance, or you've simply missed out one of the requirements. It's just very, very easily done. The requirements, especially in relation to finances, is so complex that it's very, very easy to make a mistake. So that's the financial aspect of the immigration rules that the sponsor would need to satisfy. The other two aspects are the accommodation requirement, and then finally the relationship requirement. Let's just look at the accommodation requirement very quickly. And in my experience, that's a requirement which can very easily be demonstrated. Normally, what you're looking at is demonstrating that the person who owns the property, it might be the sponsor, it might be the sponsor's family member. So you'll be submitting evidence of ownership of the property where the applicant will be residing when he or she comes to the United Kingdom. Should be easily done by way of a copy of the deeds to the property, which can be downloaded from the internet, or by submitting a mortgage statement. If the property is rented, it will be simply a case of submitting the tenancy agreement. The next bit is that normally there would be a housing report which is submitted, because it's not enough for the owner of the house to say, look, this person can stay at the property, or for the sponsor to say, I own the property, my husband or wife can live at the property. That's not sufficient. The accommodation has to be adequate, it has to be sufficient, it has to be free of certain hazards. So normally what the Home Office requires is a certain report which deals with whether the accommodation is sufficient or not. So if you get a proper report done by a surveyor, the report will deal with the size of the property, how many rooms there are, will deal with who lives at the property, and also if it's the case that there's enough space for the applicant to come and live at the property, it'll confirm that, you know what, when the applicant comes to the UK and lives at the property will not be overcrowded. So you normally have a housing surveyor who comes and does a report. Finally, if it's not your own property, it's not the sponsor's property, you will need a letter from the owner confirming that the applicant can come and reside at the property. So in terms of the accommodation requirement, it is normally fairly straightforward. It's the ownership of the property or the tenancy agreement confirming that the property is rented, a property inspection report confirming that there's enough space there, and then a letter from the owner or the head landlord confirming that the applicant, husband or wife, whoever's coming to the United Kingdom, can stay at the property. So the accommodation requirement can normally be met quite easily. And we don't have that much time, so I do want to deal with the last requirement that needs to be met, which is evidence of the relationship. Now, what I want to say is that the evidence of the relationship is distinct, different from demonstrating that the marriage has been undertaken and is valid and legal. So the marriage certificate obviously deals with the marriage. So it evidences the fact that there has been a marriage, and the marriage certificate demonstrates that it's been properly registered in accordance with the laws of the home country. But what we are looking at now is how do you demonstrate that the relationship is genuine and subsisting, which is a completely different point. And the best way to sort of demonstrate that is, let's say in 2017, beginning of 2017, there's somebody who goes to Pakistan and gets married, and you've got the marriage certificate which confirms that. It's in accordance with the laws in Pakistan, so fantastic, it's been registered, etc. That only demonstrates that there has been a marriage. What is the evidence that from the beginning of 2017, 12 months, 14, 15 months have now passed. So what's the evidence that that relationship is subsisting? Because that's a different aspect of the rules. It's not sufficient to show marriage. You have to demonstrate that the relationship is subsisting. So how do you demonstrate that? And that's what you need to satisfy. Now, normally what the Home Office wants to look at is, if the marriage took place 12 months ago, has the sponsor in the United Kingdom, has the sponsor gone back to meet the applicant or not? So that's something that they will look at. Obviously, if the application has been submitted within a few months of the marriage taking place, there's no need to go back. But if the application is being submitted, let's say 12 months down the line, there is normally a requirement as far as the Home Office is concerned. There's nothing in the rules, but in reality, the Home Office does require the sponsor, to go back where the marriage has subsisted for 12 months or more. The other way that the relationship is demonstrated on paper is by way of evidence of telephone calls which have been made between the parties from the applicant and the sponsor, by way of any WhatsApp messages that are being sent to and from the applicant and the sponsor. That all has to be printed, and we normally get asked, well, is it sufficient to simply submit the last 3 months of evidence of the relationship? Is it sufficient to submit the last 6 months of evidence of relationship? No. In terms of the 6-month requirement, that relates to normally finances. In terms of the relationship, you should submit all the evidence that you have of the relationship. And if, for example, you got married in 2017 and you've been talking to each other from 2016, you should be submitting evidence from 2016 onwards. And as a minimum, you should be submitting evidence of the relationship from after you got married. So the key documents are evidence of your telephone calls, evidence of your messages between the parties. It may be that you're sending money to your partner abroad, and you may have, for example, Western Union slips. You may be making bank transfers, so there'll be evidence of money going from the sponsor to the husband or wife in their home country. So when we're looking at demonstrating that the relationship is subsisting, it's those matters which have occurred after the marriage. So photos relating to the period after the marriage, telephone calls between the parties after the marriage, messages between the parties after the marriage. Now, if the applicant, the wife in their home country is pregnant, again, the evidence of that pregnancy would be submitted. So you do need to give some thought to what evidence of the relationship you will be submitting with the application. It's not sufficient simply to rely on evidence of the marriage. It's the evidence of the relationship which is equally important. So what I've tried to do in this show is to look at what an applicant needs to get together in their home country: the English certificate, the TB certificate, any previous marriage divorce certificates, the current marriage certificate, etc. They get that ready there. And as far as the sponsor is concerned in the United Kingdom, the sponsor needs to concentrate on the financial requirement, the accommodation requirement, and also the requirement in relation to the relationship. So I hope that that's given a good general broad sort of overview of the requirements that need to be fulfilled when making a spouse application. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of the show. Inshallah, we'll be back next week on Monday at 6 o'clock. Until then, Assalamu alaikum.